It's a great honor to invite to my podcast General David Petraeus, four-star general and former CIA director, one of the America's most respected military minds. He is currently a chairman and partner at KKR Global Institute. General Petraeus, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
Absolutely. I wanted to start by focusing on U.S. involvement in settling the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, negotiating ceasefire as the first step and peace as the next. As we look back at the 3-year war, Russia is a violent aggressor, taking over 20% of the pre-war Ukrainian territories. Both Russia and Ukraine suffered enormous casualties, not just servicemen, but civilian lives. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think about the current phase of the conflict, and can both sides come together for a peaceful agreement?
Well, the short answer to the second part of that question, I think, is it largely depends on President Putin being willing to agree to certain conditions that I tend to believe are absolutely essential for Ukraine. Now let me back up and talk about the current situation. Obviously, I'd love to see a ceasefire that is durable. That is what the U.S. administration has said it is seeking. Not just a temporary ceasefire, although 30-day temporary ceasefire in certain respects, fine. But what's really needed is to halt this war, stop the extraordinary bloodshed on both sides, allow Ukraine to focus on its economy and establishing what is going to be, I think, the military-industrial superpower of Europe, given the cutting-edge manufacturing, design, and employment of unmanned systems of all different types, and so forth and so on. I've been to Ukraine 5 times since the invasion of 2022. I was in there prior to that, down in the Donbass, actually in the front lines of what at that time was largely a frozen conflict, as you'll recall, the result of the 2014 occupation of Crimea and then part of the southeastern portion of the country known as the Donbass. In fact, I've been going to Ukraine since it was a Ukrainian Republic of the USSR, was the very first trip when I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, making the first trip by a Chief of Staff to the Soviet Union since George C. Marshall went to Yalta back in the final year of World War II. The situation is very hard on both sides, but Russia does continue to make incremental gains on a daily basis. They have now almost pushed the Ukrainians out of that portion of Kursk province that they had occupied. So there's still a very small presence in Russia there, and then also in another location, Belgorod, where they have also done a recent offensive, but again, not that deep by any means into that province. The losses on the Russian side are just unimaginable. As somebody who was privileged to command 2 different wars and spent most of my nights writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers as a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 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 5 combat commands as a general officer alone. And I don't know how actually the Russian Federation can continue to deal with these losses. I just keep thinking there has to be a moment where they can no longer recruit new soldiers. As you probably know, the way they're doing it is with enormous enlistment bonuses, or essentially a year's salary. But the Russians have lost now, or had killed and wounded, now it's estimated to be 900,000. And of those, over 500,000 did not return to the front lines. In other words, they were killed or so seriously wounded that they couldn't go back and rejoin their comrades in the fight. Very tough casualties on the Ukrainian side, plus, as you noted earlier, innumerable civilian casualties. Russia has hit a children's hospital in Kyiv. It's hit a train station. It's hit a number of what can only be described as civilian infrastructure targets, not just the efforts that they have taken to hit every single thermal power plant, every hydroelectric power plant, and the infrastructure around the nuclear plants that transforms the energy and then transmits it. So again, a very, very tough situation. probably a bit tougher on the Ukrainian side because, of course, they're heavily outnumbered by Russia, 4 or 5 to 1, probably in manpower at this point. And their economy is probably 12, 14 times the size of Ukraine's as well. But the assistance from the United States, from Europe, from other Western nations around the world has been very, very substantial. And it is what has enabled Ukraine to avoid losing more of their territory than they have. And of course, we should remember that in the first year of the war, Ukraine won the Battle of Kyiv. Russians had to withdraw from the two thrusts that were pointed out at the heart of the Ukraine's capital. They won the battles of Sumy and Chernihiv in northeastern Ukraine, the Battle of Kharkiv in the east, the second largest city, and regained control of most of Kharkiv province as well. But it's not a frozen conflict. There is, as I noted, incremental ground taken by the Russians in different locations on a daily basis. None of those yet accumulate to something really strategically important, although the loss of Pokrovsk, which is very much in the crosshairs of Russia right now down in the southeast, that would be a significant loss if the Ukrainians had to withdraw. And that may be necessary in the weeks that lie ahead, although they have been, again, causing extraordinary casualties. The many big game changers for Ukraine, among them the air and ballistic missile defenses provided by the U.S. and NATO countries, but in particular, the Ukrainian design, manufacture, and employment of extraordinary unmanned aerial systems and unmanned ground systems, robotics and so forth, and remotely controlled vehicles, and unmanned maritime systems. Ukraine has sunk 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, largely forced the Black Sea Fleet ships out of the Western Black Sea, which is significant, very significant, because it allows Ukraine to export grain by ship from Odessa and other ports in the southwestern part of the country to North African countries that are desperately in need of that particular grain. It's still about 25% of the world's grain exports, not production, but exports. In Egypt in particular, its food security depends on this. Obviously, it's very important for the fiscal situation in Ukraine to be able to export and gain the hard currency that comes from that. So now, where are we? Well, very, very tough situation on both sides. Concerns in Ukraine, of course. I was just there about 4 weeks ago. Again, concerns about the support that will be coming from the U.S. and Europe. I think that's been answered in recent weeks by Europe stepping forward in a way that's totally unprecedented. And I offer congratulations to the administration for getting Europe to do something no previous American president of either party has been able to do, which is to get them really serious about providing more for their own defense. And that said, I do think that NATO is very important for the U.S. I strongly agree with those members of Congress, a very large number, who have said that the U.S. should never withdraw from NATO, nor should we give up the position of Supreme Allied Commander Europe. But again, that can all evolve in the weeks that lie ahead, and there will be actions in other arenas, in the economic and trade arenas, that will influence those relationships as well. Europe is very, very important to the U.S., though, and the U.S. is very important to Europe. And of course, when you think about what we're trying to do elsewhere in the world to deter would-be aggressors, say in the Indo-Pacific region, in the Middle East, what have you, it's very important that what you do in one part of the world strengthens deterrence in other parts and doesn't weaken it. I would contend that the red line in Syria over chemical weapons use that turned out not to be a red line undermined deterrence, keeping in mind that deterrence is a function of a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other. In fact, I was in Singapore in the Prime Minister's office when that red line turned out not to be a red line. He said, General, that reverberates out here. It has repercussions in the South China Sea and other locations like that. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan when we didn't have to withdraw, and then the way we conducted it, also probably undermined deterrence, including very likely with Putin, who probably thought if a country can't keep 2,500 troops on the ground in Afghanistan, having not lost a soldier in 18 months and at a reasonably affordable price, knowing that it's likely that you'll come back to regret that decision later on, If they're not willing to do that, why are they going to respond forcefully if I launch another invasion of Ukraine? And of course, we did respond forcefully, led the world, I think, very impressively, albeit with endless debate over the provision of critical weapon systems such as the M1 tank, the multiple launch rocket system, the dual purpose improved conventional munitions, cluster munitions, F-16s, long range Army tactical missile system, restrictions on that on Russian soil, et cetera, et cetera. But this endless debate was very, very unhelpful at critical times, deprived Ukraine of critical weapon systems and sometimes of other countries' weapon systems, because the Germans, for example, would not allow countries that have their Leopard 2 tank to deliver them to Ukraine until the U.S. actually delivered some M1 Abrams tanks. So, but this is where we are now, a very, very tough situation. Every night, Ukraine is getting hit by Iranian drones, occasionally Russian missiles and other projectiles. Every night, Ukraine is sending dozens, sometimes even more than that, of long-range drones. They now reportedly have a 1,000-kilometer missile they can produce themselves as well. So plenty of damage to the Russian refineries and fuel storage systems and airfields and so forth. And again, I very much share President Trump's desire to see this terrible bloodshed end, and to see it end in a way with a settlement that is enduring. And that really is the key. And if you think through what would make it enduring, there's a variety of options, I think, that would be possible, uh, although not all are all that realistic. The very best solution would be what we did in Korea. First of all, we were on the ground fighting, and then once we reestablished the front line, if you will, roughly where it was between North and South Korea before the North launched their invasion, our troops were right up in the front lines alongside South Korean troops and other countries' troops, because that was a coalition at that time. And that's a pretty convincing deterrent. If you're going to have to kill Americans and the Americans have a nuclear umbrella over it and all the rest of this, I think that that is a very, very solid deterrent, even though Americans are now not in the front lines, with the exception of the joint security activity and some other locations are generally pulled back a bit from, but they're very much on the peninsula, quite close to the 38th parallel. I don't think that's in the cards. The British and French and others have, and many others actually have volunteered to be a coalition of the willing to put troops on the ground. But again, what we hear is that the troops would not be on the front lines, and it's understandable for their domestic political reasons. But having them interior in Ukraine, I'm not sure what that does. Uh, I don't know what the real question is. What would be done by such a force to retaliate for a Russian violation of the ceasefire? And that's the real question. In the beginning, there was talk about this being a peacekeeping force. Well, I've been in two peacekeeping forces as the chief of operations. One was the UN force in Haiti. We needed peacekeeping forces because there was no police that was really worthy of the name, and there were seriously bad guys and criminals and others that needed to be policed. And essentially, our forces did that. We kept the peace in that situation. In Bosnia, obviously, you had three warring factions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You had the Bosniaks, the Croats, and the Serbs, and they had recently killed tens of thousands, if not more than that, of each other. The total losses were well into the hundreds of thousands, terrible damage to civilian infrastructure and so forth. And there did need to be an overarching force that ensured that the peace was not broken, and performed a number of other tasks as well, albeit with all the civilian agencies helping to do a lot of that that we did not have to do as the military. In Ukraine, there's no need for a peacekeeping force. I mean, the Ukrainian police can more than police the peace, if you will. What is needed is a retaliatory force of some type. Again, have forces on the ground if that helps, if they think that there's some value to that. It's a little bit elusive in my mind. But what's really needed is some kind of air to ground or surface to surface retaliatory capability. And that's pretty limited in Europe. U.S. has a fair amount of that, although we'd have to position it properly. It doesn't have to be on the ground. It could be in air bases outside Ukraine and the Baltic states or some of the Eastern European countries. But at the end of the day, that's the real question, I think. And I think it has proven to be a pretty thorny issue as European countries have sought to craft an option that would be, again, convincing and helpful and in making this enduring. And when I keep turning this over, it seems to me that the way to make it enduring would be to enable Ukraine so much that it can retaliate. We believe that will be the case. It certainly is retaliating on a daily basis, but enable it to retaliate so much that they could do real damage to the Russians and absolutely stop them cold if the Russians tried to regain more of that so-called Nueva Rossiya, which is even more than the 20% of Ukraine that is occupied right now. So that's how my thinking is evolving on this. Again, I very strongly support the efforts to achieve a ceasefire, uh, but with, in bold print and underscored, a durable ceasefire, one that can be and will be maintained. And then what is it that would enable that to happen? And it seems to me that providing Ukraine even more than we have, enabling them with the $300 billion of Russian assets that are frozen if Russia won't really come to the table seriously and strings this out, continued support and assistance, particularly when it comes to some items that Ukraine can't manufacture for itself. And that would include, in particular, the air and ballistic missile defense systems that the U.S. and other European countries have provided. So that's sort of
General, let me just
long
get back.
answer.
Yeah, yeah. It's you. I wanted to unpack a few things that you said. One would be, what concessions do you expect Ukraine or Russia to make to keep that peace, right? So you just mentioned a lot of things, including the 3 billion that are frozen. Would that be considered in the business an escrow as an
Well,
keeping the
it's an
peace?
action that could be taken by the Europeans if President Putin is not truly serious about negotiating an enduring ceasefire. I don't want to get into the premature concession of this or that. I mean, we've heard plenty of what the outline would be already from um, American and other policymakers, even in Europe. We can sense what the contours would be, which is essentially freezing the lines where they are. But there should not be a concession that keeps Ukraine from rearming. That would be suicide for Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Um, and we will also need to pledge to help Ukraine rebuild, which is going to be a very substantial task. Also, help Ukraine get to the EU. We can leave NATO membership alone for now. But the real issue here is how to enable Ukraine to have the kind of force that will keep Russia from thinking that they can make further gains at acceptable costs. That's a real dynamic change that would be required, in my view, to actually ensure that the Russians don't seize more territory that is not theirs. They can make all the argument they want about Russian speakers wanting to return to Russia, but if you go back and look at when there were actually surveys conducted of the people in Ukraine before Russia seized Crimea, so this is more back at the beginning of the free Ukraine in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, uh, the numbers were 90-ish%, give or take a bit, in every single province, with the exception of Crimea, which was somewhere around 60%, which is to be expected because you did have a very large number of Russian speakers. It was a Russian tourist destination. It's where the Black Sea Fleet has always been headquartered, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like almost you need to build a similar Iron Dome structures on Ukraine and US. I think Trump hinted on that to protect Ukraine and protect US from potential future aggressions, because you really want to make sure that Russia doesn't just break the peace treaty with Ukraine, but doesn't go after other countries like Moldova or neighboring countries that are to the south of Russia.
There's
Is
no
that
question that Russia would take Moldova if they took Ukraine, but there's a lot of Ukraine that stands between Russia and Moldova. And I think if it were to take both those countries, then it would seek to take Lithuania, maybe some of the Baltic states. He's pretty obsessed with Lithuania as well. Look, we should have been listening much more carefully when he answered the question about the worst geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century, which you could choose World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, any other number of catastrophic developments. And his response was that the most catastrophic geopolitical event was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That gives a huge insight to what it is that has been galvanizing him ever since he took power in the Russian Federation. They have parts of an Iron Dome. We're really thinking again about the air and ballistic missile defense. They don't have enough to cover the whole country. They clearly need more of that. Odessa is often penetrated, so, as are some of the other important metropolitan areas of Ukraine. But again, that certainly would be among the tasks that we would want to see Ukraine fulfill, and we would have to help them, I think, to do that. But again, I don't know that would be something that would be acceptable to Vladimir Putin. And if that's the case, we need to think through what it is that we would do to get him to the table in a serious manner. And I think that really at the heart of it, it is to enable Ukraine even more so that once again, Russia cannot achieve additional meaningful gains at an acceptable cost. And they've shown that they're willing to take extraordinary costs. It could be 1 million killed and wounded within a couple of months.
assuming, and I'm a strong believer that at some points common sense will prevail and we will reach the peaceful agreements, but at the same time, both sides launched a huge propaganda campaigns to entice hatred to one another that will probably last for generations. Russian civil population really supports Putin. They're brainwashed to hate Ukraine, EU, and US, being pushed closer to China and India. Do you think we're again at the brink of another Cold War?
Well, there's an awful lot of smart folks that make an argument that we're already in a Cold War with China, and therefore, to a degree, with its partners, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Um, Again, I think there's some challenges with that historical analogy. The original Cold War, which was with the Soviet Union and its satellite countries, we had very little trade with them. The U.S. did virtually nothing economically with Russia other than occasionally sell some excess wheat, almost as a humanitarian gesture. Yet we were talking with them all the time, of course, and we did actually reach some agreements when it came to nuclear weapons, the intermediate nuclear weapon accord and so forth, which pulled those out of Europe in the case of the United States, did away with them. Um, so again, I think there's some argument, a substantial argument that can be made that we are in a Cold War, primarily with China. But you have to remember that our policymakers rightly have observed that you can de-risk what you do with China, but you cannot decouple. We're much too heavily dependent on them, and they are much too heavily dependent on us. They can't feed their people, nor can they feed their livestock unless they get from us what we export to them, largely in agricultural terms.
Understood. One final question that I really wanted uh, to ask you. Um, the war is going on in the other continent, and a lot of everyday Americans, they just don't understand why we support and why we should care for resolution of that war. Um, I wanted to make sure that we do our best to tie that that war connection to US and why should every American care for peaceful resolution. How would you go about telling everyday American that it's very important to pay attention to what's going on there and very
Sure.
important to get the peace done?
So again, this is not about charity. This is about cold, hard reality and U.S. national interests. Um, we have learned the hard way that if you're not engaged in a location, that something can happen that will then suck you into it. We should want to see preservation of democracy, free market economics, and the other principles and values that we've held dear ever since the founding of our own great republic. And that's the case when it comes to Europe, and I would extend Europe, obviously, to include Ukraine. Again, Ukraine is an imperfect country, government, what have you. There are still challenges with corruption, with oligarchs that have oligopolies in certain sectors, with not quite adequate judicial system and all the rest, although it has improved in every one of those areas. I've actually had conversations with President Zelensky. One time when I was there, I asked him what he's doing to make the country investable. Again, keep in mind, I'm a partner in one of the world's biggest investment firms. And I said, we would never have invested in Ukraine even before Russia started the occupation of Crimea and then the further invasion in 2022. What are you doing to make this investable in terms of the rule of law, the government efficiency and bureaucracy, anti-corruption, opening up various sectors to real competition instead of control by individual billionaires, et cetera, et cetera. And he had answers for every one of those points. The parliament and he have continued to work during this time. Of course, this is a period of martial law, by their law, which is, of course, why they can't run an election. And even the opposition figures with whom I talk quite regularly when I'm over there don't want to see elections at a time of war. You just cannot conduct that adequately. And all the issues that would have to be resolved, what about the Ukrainians that are still in various European countries because of women and children in particular? How do you deal with all this? So, but the bottom line is that this is hugely significant to the United States. If there's an erosion of the free world, that affects us. We benefit tremendously from the architecture, the global architecture of the so-called rules-based international order. It has been vastly to our advantage. By the way, it's also been vastly to the advantage of China and other countries that have developed so impressively during the time that the U.S. has, again, largely led this rules-based international order. Now, does that mean that the Europeans don't need to do more? Absolutely not. They absolutely need to do more. And they are now. And I think it's a credit to President Trump for getting them to do more, that we now need probably to reassure them a bit that we are still committed to NATO, will still be the foundation for any kind of legitimate operation that is conducted there and so forth. But it's the same elsewhere in the world. The reason we're supporting Israel or supporting some of the Gulf states, they may not have the governmental structure we have, but they have aligned national interests. And that's what this is all about. Again, this is not about humanitarian assistance, although we provide some of that to be sure. It's about cold, hard national interests. And our interests are served by being part of and leading in certain respects the NATO alliance and the security arrangements that we have in Europe, those that we have in the Indo-Pacific, where we also have obviously alliances and partnerships. The same in, again, where we are engaged in various ways. But keep in mind that, the American public needs to remember that we're not dying for Ukraine. We're not on the ground fighting for Ukraine. They're fighting for themselves. This is not a case where we want it more than they do, as occasionally, once or twice as a commander in 2 wars, I went to and inclined to support you when you need it. I remember when President Bush announced the commitment to the surge in Iraq, and he then went around to all the countries that we'd supported over the last decade or two, including a number of those in the former Soviet Union, and they all contributed. Poland Georgia even. We had a whole brigade combat team, almost, of Georgian forces in Iraq, in an area of responsibility, taking casualties and serving very impressively until Russia invaded Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and we had to send those forces home very, very quickly. So, again, I think it is really important to recognize that this is not charity. It's not just a helping hand because that's a nice thing to do, and it is a nice thing to do, but you've got to see to your own needs first always. I remember President Obama saying we want to do nation building at home, and that is correct. But you also want to ensure that the global situation is one that is favorable to the pursuit of our national interests, which include economic interests, they include trade interests, they include societal, and again, the belief in the freedoms and values that we have fought for over the centuries that we have had this United States of America.
I think we can't forget that, peace and prosperity with the global economy uh, will 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 be given to everybody, right? So
Well, it's not self-preservation, here. It doesn't take care of itself. It takes stewardship. There's a great book that came out a couple of years ago called The Jungle Grows Back. And it lays out how the jungle is authoritarian regimes. It's uh, the countries that are not satisfied with the status quo, the revolutionary powers. It's extremists. It's others that pose a real threat to the global architecture as it is, which is imperfect to be sure, but it's a lot better than what it would be if we don't tend to the garden, if you will, and if we allow the jungle to grow back as it will, if not confronted.
yeah, and at the same time, to keep the control of the jungle, we have to make sure we invest in U.S. military. Thanks to
Absolutely,
your
sure. Yep.
lessons learned
Mm.
with the unmanned warfare, like you said,
Mhm.
with the unmanned drone strikes, unmanned torpedo
Right.
warfare, Iron Dome, all of that requires money and investment, and that's why Americans should care to develop that to make sure that not only U.S. benefits but also all the allies.
Absolutely. No, I fully subscribe to peace through strength, which I think was originally coined, at least in my lifetime, by Ronald Reagan, and has been embraced by most presidents since then, including our current president. But that requires funding. It requires thoughtful use of those funds. It requires that we accelerate the transition from some of our existing force structure to force structure of the future. What Ukraine is doing is providing weapons of the future for their forces right now. Their procurement system is performing incredibly impressively, and I visit drone units. They continue to grow. They are training all over Ukraine in various facilities, and they continue to refine what it is that they have in all different types of unmanned systems. They've actually conducted the first ever attack, an offensive, which had no soldiers in it. It was unmanned robotic vehicles and some even programmed, others remotely piloted. It's drones that are, again, remotely piloted of various types, suicide drones, reconnaissance drones, long range strike drones, and the rest. So they're really at I think it's accurate to say, not just the cutting edge, but the bleeding edge of these technologies. The last time I was there, again, about a month or so ago, there's a Ukrainian organization called Brave One, which had pulled together this enormous expo in which there were hundreds of unmanned systems companies of all type laid out with their booths and and the models of what it is that they do and all the rest of this. And then when I visited the Nemesis Battalion, it's all publicly known. It has its own website. It's now Nemesis Regiment, in fact. They showed us all the latest stuff that they have done, which again, I'd been there a few months earlier. It's it's again transformed dramatically. And the way they go about this is something that we should be learning from because our old sort of industrial age procurement system but in contrast, tends to produce yesterday's technology for tomorrow's wars. Although we are making strides, and if I could suggest a target for the DOGE team, it would be to focus on the Pentagon's procurement system and see how that could be made vastly more efficient, swifter, and also produce what we'll need in the future, not just more of what we have today.
Great advice. Again, we are out of time, and I wanted to thank General Petraeus for sharing his wealth of knowledge with us. And Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.